Perceiving this will work is spend first third of it talking about this idea that I'd had of how to categorize the different ways that you can use hypermedia in real and practical ways, and I kind of came up with these categories, and I'm hoping that people will tell me, no, that's not right, or here's another category you haven't thought of, and so on and so forth. And then, for the next section, I'd like people to actually go out there and start surfing. Fire up whatever is your favorite tool that can sniff HTTP requests. Run applications on your machine, go to websites, and start looking for examples of hypermedia out there in the wild. It's the question we get all the time. Well, can you show me somewhere that does it? Can you show me what a hypermedia API looks like? So we've got a lot of people who know what we're looking for here. Hopefully I provided a little bit of structure to the organization, and I'd like to start to put those examples on the RESTMES GitHub wiki. Okay. So while we do that, I send you off searching. I have a little kind of discussion that I'd like to do about link relations, because I think that's a fundamental piece of the hypermedia story, and I have a few ideas, and I'd like to field questions and stuff. And then for the last section, I'd like to go over what people have found. And if you find it, put it on the wiki. Try and find the right category and put it on the wiki. So that's the basic plan of events. And it might not go that way, but that's fine because we're flexible and adaptable. So, what I have done on GitHub Wiki is I've created this page called Hypermedia Examples. And I have categorized the uses of hypermedia into relations, resources, reference data, reduction of payload size, redistribution of effort, redistribution of functionality, and reactive applications. And that they're kind of sort of in ascending sophistication of hypermedia usage. And I've abused some terms also there. But those are my 7 R's of hypermedia. So we'll start with the most obvious that we're kind of used to when people talk about hypermedia, and that is relations between two concepts. I pulled up an example here from the Huddle API. It's a great set of documents. That didn't work. I guess I broke the link. Somebody's going to have to fix that.
That's the wiki doesn't respond right away, so you should be able to.
I'll tell you what, we'll do this one. I believe it's listed on the... there. So this is an API that's out there in the wild. It has this XML representation that comes back, and they've defined their own media type. They use this particular format for specifying the links, and you can see there we've got things like rel equals avatar, rel equals recommendation. So here we have 2 concepts within their domain, the avatar person and the friend, and there is a relationship between them. It's kind of, sometimes I kind of think it's unfortunate that rel is called link relation. I actually almost prefer this notion of link type, because I think type infers that it's bringing some semantics to the table. So I like to say, well, it's a type of it. It's a link that points to an avatar. So this is by far the most common way, but it's a pretty passive relationship. It just kind of sets it out there and says, okay, these 2 things are related together. I'm not really going to do anything for you, but if you want to traverse that and explore it, go ahead. So be it. So the next one I have resources, and I kind of don't mean resources in a REST term. I kind of mean it more in when you're writing an app or a desktop app. Often there's like little kind of static resources that you want to embed into your application. There's an image, a logo, a was telling somebody the other day, I downloaded a printer driver the other day, and the printer driver itself, code, the DLL was probably a few hundred K, but the download was like 8 megs because it had localization resources for 45 different languages. And when you have this thing where you have an app that needs some kind of static resources that you can go and get, why really bundle it in with the original app? Why not just make a reference, a link in some response? So if somebody's using that app and you come to the point where you might need that static resource, then go download it. Once you take caching into account, you don't necessarily have to pay a price of loading it every time they go and visit that part of your app. So if you put short caching on it, maybe they'll load it more times than they would if you'd installed it as part of the app. But by having smaller downloads, especially for mobile devices and desktop apps, installing an app becomes smaller because your actual install package is smaller. So you can use that type of hypermedia to also provide a certain amount of dynamic nature. You've got applications now that we're publishing to stores, and there's a whole process that you need to go through in order to update that. If you're loading those resources from some remote location, then you have the opportunity to change it without necessarily having to redeploy your app in the App Store. And then I was looking around on my machine last night, let's see if I can find an example of this usage. And Windows 8 is quite interesting that it actually, a lot of its little apps that sit there on the dashboard, they do make a lot of calls, HTTP requests back to the server. This weather app was interesting. So it brings back this little chunk of XML. I said, oh, there's a link in it. Cool, that's a great. Hold on a second. That's not HTTP. So it brings another interesting idea here, is that, well, they've used the notion of a link to point to a resource, which is an image, it's a .png file, but it is actually embedded within the deployed application. So even if you do want to ship those static resources along with your package that you're deploying, there is still value in using that notion of a link, with the nice thing being is if tomorrow you decide, I don't want to use that thing that we embedded in anymore, next time the weather app goes and makes this request and it pulls it down and it says source equals, and that URL changes to be http:// now it's making a remote request out. You completely change the behavior of your app and where it goes and gets that data from, because you're using a uniform resource locator in order to get that embedded resource. So the other one, reference data. We all have apps that we build at some point or other where we need to display a list of things to people. And the traditional HTML way is, well, you cannot embed that list of options directly in, but if that list starts to get long, it's kind of nice to be able to go off and get that list from somewhere else. And instead of embedding into your client some client-side logic that says, I have this control on the screen, and this control gets its data from this particular location, and binding that knowledge into your application, why not put a link there and let you follow that link in order to retrieve that information so that you can fill that list with information. Again, the nice part about that is the scope of that list, you may decide to change it further down the road. Your business reason may change. Well, last week you wanted to show all of the customers, even if you hadn't had an order with it, or you want to show all of your customers in this particular drop-down. And then there's a decision, well, this is getting pretty long. How about we only show customers that have had orders within the last 4 months in this drop-down by default? just to reduce the load time of that piece of data. And you change the link in the representation that comes back, the client blindly follows that link, and it now gets the reduced list. We're again changing the behavior of our client without having to redeploy the client. A lot of these concepts are more relevant to people writing non-browser apps because, well, the browser app you're downloading it anyway, right? However, if you have a browser app where you're writing a client to some third-party API, well, now you're in the same kind of situation as you don't have control of that third-party API. So when you're building an API that you know other people are going to consume, if you think about these kind of things, you can't go out and change those clients because you didn't write the client. So sometimes, even in a browser environment, these concepts can be useful. So, reduction of payload size, it's another, it does kind of overlap a little bit with reference data. That's kind of what you're doing already by moving the list out of the main body that you're retrieving. But there are other benefits. There are other areas that you can use it, not just for reference data. You can get into this idea of, well, okay, let's just return kind of a summary data for some entity, just the high-level stuff, just the stuff the person wants to see immediately, and then we'll maybe give them a more details button if they want to drill down into more details, and only then go and get that secondary piece of data. So it's an excellent way of using the design concept to improve the performance of your application by breaking up your application into smaller pieces so that the information the user only gets exactly what they need. Again, this has to be done in careful combination with caching because latency of the network request is a big deal, and you don't want to be making additional requests unless it's worth it. You also want to make sure that if you are going off and getting information from secondary requests, then do them asynchronously. Again, from a web browser perspective, a lot of that is taking care of it for you. But once people start building more app store type applications, these concepts are very important, and they tend to get forgotten because people they're not living in the browser world anymore, so they kind of take a different approach to building applications. Whereas a lot of the concepts that do work really well for browsers do apply just as well within apps. Redistribution of effort. So when you retrieve a representation from the server and you have links to related resources, there's nothing saying that all of those related resources need to be on the same server. They might be this week, and next week you experience explosive growth and you need to be able to handle more customers, and well, okay, let's look at our functionality that we have in our app. Where are we getting heavy load? Let's move some of that functionality off onto a separate server. So there are various approaches to the scaling. You can throw load balancers in front and reverse proxies, and there's all sorts of ways. Those are really technical infrastructure things. These are techniques that are much more related to the app and the design of the app, where you can literally go in and say, okay, I'm going to vertically partition my app, and this type of functionality will be handled here and this type there. Again, web browsers are already doing a lot insofar as they use content distribution networks for JavaScript libraries and stuff like that, but the same can be applied within your own apps and your own APIs. Restriction of functionality. This is where if you go beyond just using links to glue things together and you start introducing the behavior of your application and representing the behavior of your application as links, you get the ability to now enable and disable capabilities within your app. The server makes the decision, should we let the user do this? Yes, okay, include a link. No, don't include a link. At that point, when you're building your client, you've got to be a little more adaptive, because you can't just assume that that link's always going to be there, and if that link isn't there, you need to reflect that on your user interface and say, oh, it's not a bug that that's not there. It's not a failing in the media type, because you don't want to be telling in the media type, oh, all these things must exist. No, if it's not there, it means the user can't do that operation. And that, again, allows business logic of your application to change on the server. The client doesn't need to be redeployed. And that, if you continue that thought process about exposing behavior via links, you can get to this final point, which I like to call reactive applications, where you are defining the workflow of your client via these set of links that you're providing in the representations. So you provide a representative. Here's what you can do from here. It's like, you know, the whole driving down the street, you come to a traffic signal and say, we can go this way, we can go that way. And that you can dynamically change. You can adapt it based on the situation, changes in business logic, or just based changes in context. And once you get to that point where, you have to build clients that expect this, because the flow of the application should change. So the client can't now make all these assumptions of, when I make this request, this is what's going to happen, because maybe tomorrow that's not what's going to happen. What the client can do is say, here are the media types that I understand. Do I know how to, if I get this representation back to this media type, do I know how to display this to the user? Do I know how to take input from the user? And do I know how to send that input back to the server? And I think once you get to that point where you're building that client that can react to those responses that come back, that's really where you get to this hypermedia as the engine of application state, because the hypermedia is driving the whole workflow of your client application. So those are the categories that I came up with for grouping different pieces of hypermedia. Is there anybody who would say, okay, you're missing out a big class of stuff? Do you think that there is, well, let's first ask that question. Does anybody see, okay, is there, I mean, I see, as I've talked about this more and more, I see a certain amount of overlap in as far as restriction of functionality in reactive applications. In some way, I'm saying the same thing. There's just different levels of dynamicness in the response, and it might not be a worthwhile distinction.
One of the things we had in our application was a bookmark page, and it had hypermedia that explained the possible, I guess, functionality across the application. I mean, that was the one place you could go and you could figure out everything you could possibly do in the application, basically.
Okay.
But I don't know if that fits what category that would fit into, but I mean, it was a resource, and the only thing the resource did was say what you could do, basically.
Yeah, okay, so that comes down to almost, it's kind of it's a discovery document,
right,
as far as you've created the decoupling of the links. The client doesn't need to know
right,
exactly where the links are, but now your workflow is still defined by the client. It chooses when it wants to call which bookmark, right? So it's an absolutely valid use of hypermedia, but you're leaving the responsibility of the workflow to the client. And
right,
there's absolutely valid scenarios for
well,
that.
What kind of, if that is absolute hypermedia, which category does it fall into?
That's almost a distinct, I think it's a distinct category of just, it's a discovery type of capability. Or it's just a decoupling. Because you're just using hypermedia
just to decouple
the
the client and server. Right.
the URI space.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. You might, there might be an overlap with redistribution of effort, because I talked about redistribution of effort as purely just kind of moving it from one server to the other. But arguably, when I'm moving it from one server to the other, all really I'm doing is changing the identifier.
Right.
And what you're doing by having the bookmarks is you're allowing the identifier to change by getting the client to encode against the bookmark. So there's a little tiny bit of overlap there, but functionally it's two different goals, right? The redistribution of effort is a kind of performance goal, whereas yours is a evolvability URI space. So that's an interesting one that we could add. So there is not a plethora of questions. So I'm going to put you to work, and maybe questions will arise as you start hunting for stuff.
The only other question I had is those last two are really subtly different. I mean, one's like a point in time. Like, I'm sitting here at this point in time, this is what's available, whereas the other one is a continuation over time, right? And where I can go throughout the maze of the process, right? But really, at any point in time, if you say, okay, I've been through 4 steps, bam, this is my functionality that I have available for me.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. The only reason I kind of call it out is because this is kind of easy to do and it has a direct impact on the UI. The last one is much more mind-bending when it comes to writing a client. It's kind of easy for people to visualize this idea of, okay, I've got a UI with a bunch of buttons, and those buttons correspond to links, and well, and I'm just going to enable and disable the buttons based on links.
Sure.
So that
But there's always a human doing it, and they can say, hey, well, that's not there, I can't do that. Or, you know what I mean? Whereas humans can figure out what's going on, whereas a machine has to have every possible combination of the workflow that it could possibly go through. Because you don't have a chance during runtime to swap those things out, really.
Well, I mean, no. It is going to change at runtime because you're going to make a request.
The path it goes down changes at runtime, but you have to have those paths laid out so it can go down those paths. Unless you make the metadata or the content in a standard way that it can figure out from the resources that it got how I can move down those different paths.
Well, I think if I'm understanding correctly, that's the idea is that in the representation that you get returned to you, right, the available paths are presented for that particular resource in your current particular state based on who you are. Right. So it can completely change. And the thing is, the reasoning for why it might change sits on the server now, as opposed to the client making the decisions based on the information in the representation.
Yeah, I think it's great when your user is a human. Because a human is smart enough to look at a link and has enough contextual information to then decide I want to go to A or B or C. And then if tomorrow there's D, they say, okay, well, I understand what that means.
Yes.
But there are environments where it's not a human that's behind trying to access your service.
Well, I have an opinion on that. It's not shared by many, but I pretty much think there's a human behind most interactions. They may just have been encoded in a batch sequence of an algorithm. Take, for example, the Mike's maze, right? Mike, there's this maze where it exposes hypermedia, and you send your client off to hunt its way through the maze. It is an algorithm that has been encoded to say, if this is here, then do this. If this is here, then do that. And it finds its way out of the maze. So, but there's still a bunch of, the fact that it's not human clicking on that, I don't see a major difference. It's whether it's some algorithm that we wrote to be able to make those decisions, or whether it's some...
You're talking about dynamic workflows.
Yes, exactly.
So it cannot be hard-coded. If you're talking about a hard-coded algorithm against a dynamic workflow, that's going to break down within 5 minutes.
I don't know if the workflow is necessarily dynamic. The workflow has got to be set at some point. Right?
Well, basically what he means is that, because Darrel says that there's a human behind everything, so adapting is the same thing as ultimately a machine behind. He has human thoughts where it's like, transformed into code, right? And then steers into action.
Okay, so
But I think it's very different from me surfing around on Amazon and all of a sudden there's a new button that says you get everything.
You're right, and my algorithm is not going to take advantage of new links that are made available to you. And it will break if it makes an assumption that a link is going to be there that gets taken away. But that's part of the challenge of writing clients against hypermedia
I would
APIs.
say the challenge is on the server side is to put enough information behind the link to enable that dynamic machine interaction. I think that's what we're lacking right now.
Well, but I'm not sure if it's even necessary. Like, there's a lot of talk about, how the workflow is going to be dynamic, etc. But at some point, ultimately, your client wants to achieve a certain goal, and if the interaction is completely different, like obviously there's a new step in between that is like something that the client's not prepared to. You can't just I don't think you can freely rearrange things, like steps of a workflow, for instance, and expect clients to be sufficiently smart in order to do this. And it's not really why would you want to? Maybe.
Well, you can. You have a next link, right?
Oh,
and
yeah.
the client is told to go next. You can change that next to go to any different step that you want, as long as each step along that way is a media type that the client understands. The fact that you rearrange and take and remove steps out of that flow.
But that's not a workflow.
What you can't do is you can't introduce a new link relation type.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You
Correct.
can't do that.
But then
So now you're talking about you can't introduce a new link relation, so that breaks the reactive application. And then if you change the link relation to do something else, then you break the client as well. So why even bother?
Why do I break the client because I introduce a new link relation?
It just ignores it.
You can't expect it to
Well,
follow.
then if it ignores it, then it breaks because then you can't go there. Because now that's where you're supposed to go and you don't know by it.
So you go to Amazon to buy a book, right?
The human is fine. I mean, the human
Okay. You write an algorithm to go to Amazon for you to buy a book. You tell it to use a credit card, right? They introduce a new mechanism, which is payment by checking account. Does your algorithm to pay by credit card break? Because they added a new option? No, it just means it won't use it. Yes.
So I agree with this. But the next thing, so the next link relation is defined as I think it's a collection or sequence of elements in line. There's the next batch, a group of things, something. Next does not mean go to the next step in a way.
It's very loosely defined what next means,
So
right?
what if you have 3 possible next steps that you can choose from? You have 3 next links, so how do I know which one to change?
If your workflow requires the client to choose from 3 different links, then obviously naming all of those link relations the same thing isn't going to help your client make that choice, right? It needs to understand 2 things. It needs to understand link relations and it needs to understand media types. If it doesn't understand them, it can't use them. But in this, we can build media types and link relations in an additive way. We can add new capabilities without breaking old stuff, I believe.
But when you say it needs to, how do you explain that to a client in terms that the client can understand? If all of a sudden there's a new link relation that says, path D.
How do I do it?
Yeah,
I write a class on the client that encapsulates the functionality.
No, the server side. The server side opens up a new link relation on path D. How do you put enough semantic behind path D?
I don't try.
You mean explain as in machine readable information, right?
Right. So the client can say, okay, now I've got BCM. Oh, D. But what's D? What can I do at D that would justify me to go there?
So that's theoretically what link relation.
I don't try.
But you can do it if you have a well-known link relation and the client can be written against a link relation that knows and understands, right? If it's sufficiently
Right.
like also ultimately it doesn't help you. But if there's like a payment, maybe a payment would be wonderful.
Right, but let's think about what we're doing there, right? You're saying we're going to define this link relation, and that link relation is now going to have a set of other rules that are metadata for describing the behavior of that link. Aren't we just repeating what the purpose of a link relation is in the first place? I mean, it's kind of like using application/XML and then having a schema in your application, because now the schema is defining the semantics rather than the media type. If instead of trying to create this uber link relation that we can dynamically figure out what we're supposed to do, just create a new link type that has the specific semantics of what you want. Existing clients will not understand that new link type, and new clients will understand that new link type. There may be, I mean, forms is an interesting example, right? Because forms is sort of what you're describing, right? Because in reality, form is just another link relation type that HTML happens to use, but uses a form tag instead of a link tag, right? But it has content within it that helps the browser render those things so that we can capture some information. But the rules are pretty generic for that link. It's display some text boxes, capture some information, and then send it back in an Darrel encoded representation. If you add a new input element to that HTML form, great, now the browser can render it, right? But if you have a machine-to-machine client, that machine-to-machine client doesn't know about the existence of that new input tag. But it doesn't know the semantics of that new input tag.
If you use an XHTML form, like I did yesterday, for instance, you're supposed to serialize all the fields because you're bound to the submission rules, the form submission rules as specified in HTML specification. So if I, as a server, introduce new fields, you should submit them. They have a default value. You don't have to fill them, but you should submit them along. So I can put in the default for the sort order. Like I can have just a new field sort order, default selection, and you should just submit it. But so I think it's not realistic to magically have a new link relation, I think, and then just the clients magically figure out what they're supposed to do with them, because they're not, unless it's Skynet or something.
It's obviously a challenge, and it's possible that somewhere along the line somebody's going to come along and say this is the way a link relation can absolutely describe its behavior to a client.
Well,
my experience is I haven't seen that done effectively, and I'm not really sure we need it, but I'm happy to be proved wrong.
That might be something for like the whole sandweb guys, like like the link relation is actually a URL that resolves the machine readable description of what it means, what category means.
But to an extent, you're just pushing the description elsewhere.
Yeah.
So instead of using the link relation just as a name. So, anybody found any examples? Anybody looking?
Of any of these?
Of any of these? Yeah.
I found one. Redistribution of effort, I think is where it calls refresh. ESI includes. We use ESI includes at Beatport to cache the majority of the page, but to have just, so like the entire home page is cached except for one little piece up in the top right, which is your account information. Because this whole page takes a lot of time and effort to produce, but by caching the whole thing and just including a link in the representation, we can have Varnish do a callback to the origin server just to get that one little piece up right.
I find that it's a fascinating way of taking a cached resource but then changing it dynamically. It's kind of a funky concept in ESI. But yes, it's a good example of that distribution of load.
Account information is also what I think of as a classic example of restriction of functionality, where it's going to show you a link to your account and not someone else's. And if you're logged in, you won't see that link at all.
Right. The distinction between whether somebody's authenticated or not authenticated. Yeah.
Darrel, I've got a report that the Ustream audio is very low. Is there anything
Turn the recognition on.
Yeah, no,
I
I
think you can control that.
I'll yell louder.
Yeah.
Yeah, so authentication is another way that you can impact a representation and include that kind of auth information or not. I did, while people were looking, I did want to, and we ended up going into more of a discussion about link relations, which I think is a very interesting topic. I have questions. Does anybody know where the official registry is for link relations? David?
I do.
With the IANA.
Oh,
Are you sure? This is kind of a trick question, right? Because that's not where HTML5 registered their link relations, right?
Well, they're a bunch of clowns.
So, just so that people can see what I'm referring to. So there's the IANA link registry. Okay, who's streaming video? Oh, me. Is it this one for everybody, or is it just what you're saying?
You went through Canada.
You know, you laughed and had to check that.
That's just
Who thinks IE10 will actually resolve this page? Okay, well, you know, when you have a web that works, IANA has a registry for link relations.
It's down. I can't get to it either.
Okay, well, fortunately, we have more than one global registry for link relations. It's on the microformat site, and this is just one rel. Anybody know what the URL is to get to the?
rel values or something like that.
Yes. Okay. So, remember a while back there was a big debate about where HTML5 were going to register their link relations, and eventually microformats kind of won because it was that easy to do. And as Mike will tell you, it's really easy to add a link relation to this particular.
Just go there and add.
Yeah.
Yes, actually, you totally can just go there and add to it. And there are microformat police who will send you an email and/or delete the messages. What you do is you join the IRC channel, and then you edit here, and then you have a discussion on the IRC channel, and if you survive, it stays up.
So the general policy and procedure is if you want to use a short name like the copyright content contact for your link relations, you need to register it with an official body. Like if I go back to the example I had before with the Huddle API, they actually kind of wrote the rules.
I fixed the link there.
Oh, you did? Thank you. They create, they have rel friends, rel recommendations. If you're going to create your own link relation, and you don't want to put it up in the public registry, you're supposed to use a URI, either an URL or an ERN in the rel value there, just to ensure that you're not stepping on anybody else's toes. This is the basic idea. But that rule is not followed very, very thoroughly because it starts to get really ugly when you put links into the rel. Yes, Matt? So, the general idea is if you are going to get a short name on your link relation, you're supposed to register it with one of the registries, microformats, IAM, and preferably both. Right? So that everybody knows you've taken that word for a link relation. If you don't do that, what you're supposed to do, according to RFC 5988, the link relation spec, link header spec, you're supposed to use a URI.
Do you have an example? I cannot read that.
No, well, let's see. Well, let's look at 5988. Look that's up. So this is the spec that it defines link headers, but it also defines a lot of the stuff relating to link relations. Extended relation types. Do they have an example here? No, it's a spec. Oh yeah, there you go. No, they're using rel previous. Yeah, okay, here is an example where a link has a rel, it has a multiple rel values, because you're allowed to put more than one link relation value. Move that down, Mike. Okay, here. So that's specifying two link relations. It's saying start, which I'm presuming is a registered link relation, and also it uses an URL, HTTP example.net relation other, for whoever is publishing this API to define their own link relation.
So what would you put at that URL?
I think it's undefined. Yeah, it's not meant to be. It's not required to be resolvable.
Well, why would?
What would you?
Why wouldn't you want to have something resolvable that you can find out what's behind that thing?
Yes, some
nobody has
people.
been working on that, or
Some people are putting documentation at the end of that URL. Yes, absolutely.
But yeah, you could have some sort of machine readable, like semantic web type, like for XX through that university.
Yeah. If you want some kind of dynamically discoverable information at the end of that link, absolutely, knock yourself out.
Because theoretically, like that would work. Like how you have a certain category relation identifier, and there's a description that resolves, which itself is composed of other descriptions that are kind of standard, and then it could theoretically be very smart and somehow intelligent.
More power to people if they want to figure those things out. Absolutely.
It's probably not worth.
One other thing there's a funny thing about link relations, right? There's a certain field of thought that says, well, a link relation should be a noun, and it should be a relationship. It shouldn't be a verb, and it shouldn't be this, and it shouldn't be that, but it needs to describe a relationship between two things, right? And the best example I always come up with is, okay, well, is customer a noun, or is it a relationship between two things? I mean, to me, it could be both. A customer, I could have a link relation customer, and it's a thing that I'm going to, or it could be, well, this person is a customer of this other person. So when you start getting into those really kind of artsy-fartsy discussions about language and meaning and that kind of stuff, really it's an identifier. That's all it is. It's an identifier that you have associated some semantic meaning to. Don't get too hung up on the word.